strange historians.
Picture this. You're a 12-year-old boy in a small Bulgarian village in 1550. The morning mist clings to the valley like a shroud as you help your father tend to the sheep. The bells around their necks create a gentle melody that has been the soundtrack to your entire life. Your mother is preparing breakfast warm bread and goat's milk that tastes like home, like safety, like everything you've ever known. Then you hear it, the thundering of hooves against cobblestone. Your father's face goes white as parchment. Your mother drops the clay pitcher she's holding, and it shatters across the floor. It's like your world is about to shatter, because everyone in your village knows what those hoofbeats mean. The Sultan's collectors have come. You watch from behind a wooden cart as Ottoman officials dismount their horses. Their silk robes pristine despite the long journey. They carry scrolls and lists, and their eyes scan the gathered villagers with the cold calculation of merchants evaluating livestock. And one of them points directly at you. Your mother collapses to her knees, begging in a language they don't bother to understand. Your father stands silent, knowing that resistance means death for the entire family. You are torn away with promises that you will serve the Sultan, that you will rise to greatness, that this is an honor. But as the cart rolls away from everything you have ever known, all you can hear are your mother's sobs fading into the distance. You will never see her again. This was the beginning of your new life as a palace boy, Ghulam, in the most powerful empire on earth. And the horrors that awaited you behind the palace walls would make you long for those simple days watching sheep in the misty valleys of your homeland. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The journey to Istanbul was your first taste of the systematic cruelty that would define your new existence. You and dozens of other boys were marched for weeks across rugged terrain, inadequately fed, sleeping in the open or in crude shelters that offered little protection from the elements. The weak ones, those who couldn't keep up, who fell ill, or who simply gave up hope, were left behind to die. You learned your first lesson in Ottoman palace's life before you even reached the capital. Weakness was death, and only the strongest, cleverest, or most adaptable would survive what was to come. The boy walking beside you, maybe 14 years old, had been taken from a Greek fishing village. His name was Nikos, though he whispered to you that soon that name would be forbidden. He had tried to escape on the third night of the march, but the guards caught him before he made it a mile. They dragged him back to the camp and beat him in front of all the other boys as a lesson. His screams echoed across the countryside, and you squeezed your eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. But you couldn't block out the lesson. Escape was impossible. Resistance was futile. By the time you reached the outskirts of Istanbul, you had learned to move like a ghost, to speak only when spoken to make yourself invisible when the guards' attention turned predatory. You had watched boys disappear in the night, some who tried to run, others who simply couldn't endure another day, their empty spaces in the line, serving as constant reminders of your own mortality. The first sight of Istanbul's skyline should have been breathtaking, the minarets piercing the sky, the massive dome of Hagia Sophia, the sprawling palace complex that would become your prison. Terror, but all you felt was a hollow dread settling in your stomach like a stone. This magnificent city represented everything you had lost and everything you feared you would become upon arrival in Istanbul. You faced your first selection. Ottoman officials divided the surviving boys into groups based on their perceived potential. The process was humiliating and thorough. They examined your teeth like you were a horse, tested your reflexes, made you recite what little you knew. of letters and numbers. They measured your height, examined your skin for blemishes, and evaluated your facial features with the clinical detachment of art appraisers. The most beautiful and intelligent were destined for the palace school, the Induyun. Others would become janissaries, the elite military corps. But for those chosen for palace service, a different kind of trial awaited, one that would test not just your body's endurance, but your soul's ability to survive systematic dehumanization. You were among the fortunate ones selected for the Induyun school, housed within the walls of Topkapi Palace. The officials who made this choice looked at your clear skin, your bright eyes, and your obvious intelligence, and they smiled. You didn't understand then that their smiles were not kind. They were the smiles of predators who had found particularly promising prey. The Induyun school has been called the world's first institutionalized education for the gifted. This description, while technically accurate, obscures the darker reality of what education meant for displaced boys like you. Yes, you would learn languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. You would study mathematics, astronomy, literature. In law, you would be trained in music, calligraphy, and various crafts. But this education came at a price that extended far beyond mere academic rigors. The palace complex that became your world was a maze of marble corridors, ornate chambers, and hidden passages where danger lurked around every corner. You were housed in dormitories within the palace complex, separated from the outside world by layers of walls, guards, and protocol that made escape not just difficult, but unthinkable. The dormitory where you would sleep stretched before you like a marble tomb, lined with narrow beds covered in silk that felt like chains against your skin. Your first night in the dormitory, you lay awake listening to the sounds that would become the soundtrack of your imprisonment, the soft sobbing of homesick boys trying to muffle their tears in their pillows, the whispered conversations in languages you didn't recognize, footsteps of older students and supervisors prowling the halls after lights out. You clutched the small wooden cross your mother had pressed into your hand as you were taken away. But by morning, even that last connection to your former life would be discovered and confiscated. You were given a new name, Mehmet, and told to forget your Christian origins. Conversion to the empire's official faith was not optional, it was fundamental to your transformation from captured child into Ottoman servant. The ceremony was conducted with great pomp, as if you had chosen this path voluntarily. But you knew, and everyone knew, that choice had nothing to do with it. You repeated the words they told you to repeat, but inside, you held on to the memory of your mother's lullabies and your father's stories. But the most insidious aspect of your education was the systematic breaking down of your individual will and your reconstruction as an instrument of imperial pleasure and power. The palace operated on a complex hierarchy where advancement depended not just on academic achievement, but on your ability to please superiors. And pleasing could take many forms that no child should ever have to learn. Your first lesson in the palace's unspoken rules came from Ahmed, an older student who had been in the system for 3 years. He approached you one evening in the dormitory, his voice carrying both threat and promise. "Janu," he said, settling onto the edge of your bed uninvited. "You don't understand how things work here yet, but I can protect you, teach you, help you advance. The teachers favor me, and they listen to my recommendations about the younger boys." He let his hand rest on your shoulder, and you felt yourself freeze. You were 12 years old and had never been touched by a stranger, but something in his manner made your skin crawl. "In return," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you would need to show your gratitude. There are ways that boys like you can thank older students for their protections, special ways that stay between us. If you faced an impossible choice that thousands of boys before you had faced, refuse and risk brutal punishment, social isolation, and the end of any hope for advancement. Accept and surrender the last vestiges of your childhood innocence to a system that viewed your body as a commodity to be traded for favor and protection. There was no good choice, only survival. The palace's sexual ecosystem was complex and predatory, according to rules that had been established over generations of exploitation. Accused, castrated as boys themselves, and often bearing their own psychological scars, wielded considerable power and used it to exploit the constant stream of new arrivals. They understood the system intimately because they had once been its victims. But rather than protecting newcomers, many became its most enthusiastic enforcers. Older students preyed on younger ones, perpetuating cycles of abuse that stretched back generations. It was a twisted form of hazing, where the initiated earned their place in the hierarchy by victimizing those below them. Palace officials took advantage of their positions to access the most beautiful boys with impunity, knowing that their victims had no recourse and no one to whom they could appeal for justice. What made this system particularly insidious was its integration with the palace's official hierarchy. Sexual relationships were not hidden scandals. They were part of the social order, woven into the fabric of daily life, so completely that they seemed natural and inevitable. Boys who caught the eye of powerful patrons could find their careers accelerated, their studies easier, their lives more comfortable. Those who refused or displeased their superiors found themselves relegated to menial positions, subjected to harsher discipline, or simply disappeared from the palace rolls altogether. The psychological impact on boys like you was devastating and carefully calculated. It's cut off from your family, stripped of your original identity, and thrust into a world where your body was seen as a commodity. You developed what we might now recognize as complex trauma responses. Some boys became manipulative and calculating, learning to use their sexuality as a tool for advancement and survival. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming hollow shells who went through the motions of palace's life while their spirits died. Inside, you watched both transformations happen to boys around you. Teeny, who had been taken from the same region as you, learned to smile and flirt with the older students and teachers. Within 6 months, he had new clothes, better food, and a private tutor for his language studies. But his eyes had gone dead, and he no longer spoke of home or family. When new boys arrived, he looked at them with the same calculating gaze that the officials had once turned on him. Stefanos, a Greek boy who had been a fisherman's son, took the opposite path. He refused all advances, endured beatings and punishment, and gradually faded into a ghost-like existence. He performed his duties mechanically, studied adequately, but without enthusiasm, and seemed to disappear a little more each day. One morning, his bed was empty, and no one ever mentioned his name again. You tried to find a middle path, accepting some advances to survive, while maintaining some core of yourself that remained untouched. But the palace was designed to make such compromise impossible. Every day brought new tests, new choices between degradation and destruction, new ways that the system sought to remake you in its own image. European travelers who visited the Ottoman court occasionally glimpsed this hidden world, though their accounts were often filtered through their own cultural biases and limited understanding. A 16th century Venetian ambassador noted the excessive fondness that palace officials showed for their young male servants, describing scenes that made him uncomfortable in the extreme. He wrote of seeing boys as young as 10 or 11, dressed in silk and jewels, tending to older men with a familiarity that suggested relationships that went far beyond appropriate master-servant dynamics. A French diplomat in the 17th century wrote more explicitly about what he witnessed during a palace reception. The young pages moved through the halls like beautiful birds in cages, their eyes downcast but their bodies adorned for display. One cannot help but notice the possessive manner in which certain officials regard these children, nor the fear that flickers in the boys' eyes when their masters approach. The physical conditions of Pallas's life compounded the psychological abuse in ways that were designed to break down resistance and create dependency. You lived in cramped dormitories with minimal privacy, where every moment was subject to surveillance and control. You were awakened before dawn for prayers you had been forced to learn, fed adequate but not abundant meals at precise times, and subjected to a rigid schedule that left no time for reflection or resistance. Punishments were common and creatively designed to humiliate and break spirits. Boys who violated rules, speaking their native languages, practicing old traditions, or showing insufficient enthusiasm for their new lives faced beatings, public humiliation, or isolation in chambers barely large enough to lie down in. You witnessed a boy named Milos who had been caught praying in the manner of his former faith, forced to stand naked in the courtyard for an entire day, while other students were encouraged to mock him. The lesson was clear. Your old identity was not just forbidden. It was a source of shame. The palace's internal economy further complicated your situation and created additional layers of exploitation. You could earn small privileges through good behavior, academic achievement, or by pleasing your superiors in various ways. These privileges, better food, nicer clothing, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, access to books or musical instruments, became precious commodities in your restricted world. The system created a complex web of dependencies and loyalties that made resistance nearly impossible, and collaboration seemed like the only path to survival. You learned to navigate this economy with the calculating mind of someone much older than your years. You discovered that helping older students with their studies could earn you protection from their advances. You found that showing particular aptitude in certain subjects could gain you the attention of teachers who might shield you from the worst abuses. You realized that perfect obedience and visible enthusiasm for your new life could result in small freedoms that felt enormous in your circumscribed world. Some boys attempted escape, but the palace's location on a peninsula surrounded by water made this extremely difficult. Those who were caught faced severe punishment that was deliberately made public to deter others. You witnessed the return of a boy who had tried to flee by swimming across the Golden Horn. He was barely alive when they dragged him back. Beating he received in front of all the students left him permanently injured. He lived as a warning to the rest of you, broken, barely functional, a living example of what happened to those who chose rebellion over submission. The few boys who managed to flee faced an even more daunting challenge. They had been in the palace so long, and their original identities so thoroughly erased, that returning to their former lives was impossible. Their families might not recognize them, their communities might reject them as traitors or converts, and they possessed few skills that would allow them to survive outside the palace system. Most who escaped were recaptured within days, but even those who remained free often found themselves adrift in a world that no longer had a place for them. As you matured within the system, surviving through a combination of intelligence, adaptability, and carefully calculated submission, you faced new challenges and deeper corruption of your soul. The most successful students might eventually be appointed to high governmental positions, but this success came at the cost of perpetuating the very system that had abused them. You realized with growing horror that your teachers and supervisors, men who had shaped and damaged you, had once been boys like you, taken from their families and molded into instruments of imperial power. This recognition brought a terrible choice. You could resist the system and likely be destroyed by it, or you could embrace it fully and become one of its enforcers, selecting the next generation of boys, breaking them down and rebuilding them, maintaining the palace's hierarchies of power and exploitation. Many boys chose the latter path, finding it easier to become predators than to remain prey indefinitely. The graduation ceremony, known as Chikma, marked the end of your palace education and your entry into imperial service. After years of systematic abuse disguised as education, you emerged as a young man fluent in multiple languages. skilled in administration and diplomacy, trained in the arts and sciences. But you also emerged as someone whose soul had been systematically corrupted, whose understanding of power was forever intertwined with exploitation. Its capacity for normal human relationships had been damaged in ways that might never heal. For many graduates, this transition simply meant moving from one form of exploitation to another. Those appointed to administrative positions found themselves in a world where sexual favors and political advancement remained intertwined, where the lessons learned in the palace about power, submission, and survival continued to shape their adult lives. Those assigned to military roles carried with them the psychological scars of their palace years, often becoming either brutal enforcers of imperial will or broken men who struggled to find meaning in lives built on foundations of abuse. The Ottoman elite's attitude toward these practices was complex and carefully constructed to maintain the system while denying its most disturbing aspects. While official regulations prohibited many forms of abuse, the reality was that palace authorities turned a blind eye to behaviors that served their interests. The system produced capable administrators and loyal servants, which was its primary purpose. The human cost was considered irrelevant to its success, and any criticism was dismissed as ignorance of the empire's sophisticated methods of education and advancement. Contemporary Ottoman writers sometimes acknowledged the system's darker aspects while defending its overall value. 16th century court historian wrote, "It is true that the palace school demands great sacrifices from its students, and that not all who enter emerge unchanged. But from this crucible of discipline and learning emerge the finest servants of the empire, men whose loyalty has been tested and whose capabilities have been honed to perfection." This rhetoric of transformation and improvement masked the reality of what boys like you experienced. Your testing involved systematic sexual abuse. Your discipline involved the destruction of your original identity and the construction of a new self designed to serve imperial interests. Your learning came at the cost of your childhood, innocence, and your capacity for normal human relationships. What makes the Ottoman palace system particularly disturbing is how it combined genuine educational opportunities with systematic abuse in ways that made it difficult to separate the benefits from the horrors. Boys did receive an education that was, by the standards of the time, exceptionally advanced. You learned to read and write in languages that opened doors throughout the known world. You studied sciences and mathematics that were cutting edge for their era. You gained skills in diplomacy, administration, and military strategy that would serve you throughout your life. But this education was inseparable from your exploitation and abuse. The same teachers who expanded your mind also violated your body. The same system that gave you opportunities also destroyed your innocence. The same institution that promised advancement also ensured that advancement would forever be tainted by the methods used to achieve it. The system also reveals the complex relationship between power, sexuality, and violence in pre-modern societies. The Ottomans were not unique in their exploitation of young people. Similar practices existed in various forms throughout the ancient and medieval worlds. But the Ottoman system was notable for its scale, its systematization, and its integration into the imperial apparatus. It was not a hidden perversion, but an open institution celebrated for its effectiveness and defended by its beneficiaries by the 17th and 18th centuries. The palace system began to decline as changing military technologies reduced the importance of the janissary corps, and new forms of administration decreased reliance on palace-trained bureaucrats. European influence in changing social attitudes also contributed to the system's gradual transformation. But for the thousands of boys who passed through the palace gates during the system's height, these changes came far too late. Their stories of childhood lost, innocence destroyed, and spirits broken in service to imperial power represent one of history's most systematic examples of institutional child abuse. The boys who survived learned to navigate a world where their beauty was both asset and liability, where their intelligence was valued but their humanity was not, where advancement required surrendering pieces of their souls that could never be recovered. Some rose to positions of great power and influence, becoming viziers, generals, and governors who shaped the empire's destiny. But they carried with them the scars of their palace years, and many perpetuated the cycles of abuse that had shaped them. Others disappeared into historical obscurity, their fates unknown and their suffering unrecorded, remembered only as entries in administrative records that noted their arrival, their training, and their eventual assignment to service the palace. Walls that once echoed with the footsteps of these boys still stand today, transformed into a museum where tourists admire the architectural grandeur and artistic treasures of the Ottoman court. Visitors marvel at the beautiful chambers where the empire's elite were educated, but they see only the physical beauty of the spaces. The marble corridors keep their darkest secrets, and the rooms where education and exploitation intertwined remain silent about the price that generations of young boys paid for imperial glory. The guided tours speak of the palace, schools, educational innovations, its role in training capable administrators, its contribution to the empire's success. They do not mention the systematic abuse that was fundamental to its operation. The boys who died rather than submit to its demands, or the men who emerged from its halls forever changed by their experiences within its walls. As I finish this account, imagining your story as representative of thousands like it, I'm reminded that these tales of suffering and survival are not merely historical curiosities. They represent real human beings' children, torn from their families, stripped of their identities, and forced to navigate a world that valued their bodies and minds while dismissing their humanity as irrelevant to the empire's grand designs. You, the boy I've imagined, standing in those marble corridors with fear in your heart and silence on your lips, represent thousands of real children whose names we will never know, whose individual stories were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged by the system that created and sustained it. You're a ghost, and the ghosts of all the boys like you still walk those palace halls, reminding us that behind every empire's grandeur lies a foundation built on human suffering, and that the price of power is often paid by those who have no choice in the matter. The horror was not in the violence alone, but in how systematically it was applied, how completely it was normalized, and how thoroughly it was forgotten by history. You and boys like you lived and died in a system that treated you as beautiful objects to be molded and used, right? And your stories deserve to be remembered, not as exotic historical footnotes, but as testimonies to human resilience in the face of institutionalized cruelty. The morning air that once carried your fearful footsteps has long since faded, but your story echoes still through time, demanding that we bear witness to your suffering and remember the terrible price of the empire's golden age. In remembering your story, we honor not just your individual suffering, but the suffering of all children who have been caught in the machinery of power throughout history, used and discarded by systems that value conquest over compassion, empire over innocence. This realization brings a strange kind of clarity. If you understand now that the system isn't the result of ignorance or primitive thinking, it's the product of deliberate choices made by people who know better but choose worse. The beautiful art, the philosophical discussions, the political innovations, none of these represent moral progress. They're just different forms of human expression that coexist comfortably with unlimited cruelty. Years pass in this state of clear-eyed despair. You perfect the art of invisible service, moving through the household like a ghost that occasionally assumes solid form when needed. You watch younger slaves arrive and break, observe the cycles of violence and exploitation that never change. Witness the endless parade of respected citizens who shed their public masks in private. Some nights, you stand at your small window and look up at the same stars you once watched from your family's roof. You wonder if your parents are still alive, whether they ever think of the son they sold to survive. You imagine your siblings growing up, perhaps with children of their own, telling stories about the brother who went away when they were young. But these thoughts no longer bring pain. They're more like distant music, beautiful, but unrelated to your current existence. You've learned to appreciate them without longing for what they represent. It's a form of meditation, this ability to hold memories without attachment. The end, when it comes, arrives without warning or drama. You're perhaps 25 now, though exact age has lost meaning in this place, where time is measured in suffering rather than seasons. Your body shows the accumulated damage of years of abuse, scars that never properly healed, joints that ache from old injuries, a persistent cough that suggests something wrong in your chest. More significantly, your usefulness is declining. The guests who once fought to claim your services now barely notice your presence. New slaves have arrived with fresh beauty and unbroken spirits, making your practiced compliance seem ordinary rather than exotic. You're becoming what every slave eventually becomes. Invisible in a different way, overlooked rather than coveted. Demetrius calls you to his quarters one morning and explains that you're being sold to a mining operation in the mountains, presented as neither punishment nor rewards, simply an economic decision. Your value as household entertainment has depreciated below the cost of maintenance, okay? But you still have years of hard labor ahead of you. The mining camps are where slaves go to die slowly. Everyone knows this, including you. The work is backbreaking, the conditions lethal, the life expectancy measured in months rather than years. It's not execution exactly, but it's not survival. Either you receive this news with the same emotional flatness that has characterized your existence for years. Death in the mines or death in the household, what difference does it make? You've been dead in every meaningful sense for so long that the cessation of biological function seems almost redundant. But as you prepare for transport, something unexpected happens. Marcus, the boy who arrived around the same time as you, approaches during your last night in the familiar cell. He somehow managed to survive and even thrive in his own way, earning a position as a personal servant to Lysander's wife. But work is easier, the abuse less frequent, the food more regular. He presses something into your hand, a small piece of metal sharpened to a point. It's crude but effective, a tool that could open either locks or veins. He doesn't say anything, but its meaning is clear. You have choices about how your story ends. That night, you hold the metal shard and contemplate your options. You could try to escape, though the chances of success are virtually zero, and the punishments for failure would be excruciating. You could use it as a weapon against your captors, achieving a moment of revenge before inevitable death. Or you could turn it on yourself, choosing the timing and manner of your exit from this world. Each option has its appeal. Escape offers the fantasy of freedom, even if the reality would likely be brief recapture and tortured death. Violence would provide satisfaction, allowing you to inflict some fraction of the pain you've endured. Suicide would grant control, letting you choose dignity over degradation in your final moments. But as dawn approaches, you make a different choice. You hide the weapon where other slaves might find it, passing along the gift of options that Marcus gave you. Your story may be ending, but others are still being written. Perhaps one of them will find a different conclusion. The journey to the mines takes you through landscapes that spark forgotten memories, mountain paths that remind you of childhood adventures, streams where you once caught fish with your bare hands, villages that could be your own, filled with families who might include your surviving relatives. If you don't try to escape, the chains would make flight impossible, and the guards are experienced in preventing such attempts. Instead, You use the journey to say goodbye to the world you're leaving. You watch eagles soar overhead and remember when you dreamed of flying. You smell wildflowers and recall your mother's garden. You listen to wind through pine trees and hear echoes of your father's voice. The mining camp is everything you expected, and worse. Hundreds of slaves working in conditions that make household service seem luxurious. 8. The tunnels are narrow and unstable, prone to collapse without warning. The air is thick with dust that tears at lungs and clouds vision. The quotas are impossible, designed to extract maximum labor before inevitable death. Even here, in this final circle of hell, you discover something remarkable. The slaves have created their own society, their own forms of resistance and mutual aid. They share food when possible, take turns supporting those too weak to work, and maintain elaborate networks of communication that span the entire operation. Most importantly, they remember in whispered conversations during brief rest periods. They tell stories of their lives before captivity. They speak names of loved ones, describe customs and traditions from dozens of different cultures, and preserve languages their captors have tried to eliminate. They bear witness to each other's humanity in ways that their masters never could. Your own story becomes part of this oral history. The boy from the mountain village who survived years in an Athenian household. The child who was sold to pay his family's debts and endured unimaginable abuse while maintaining fragments of his identity. The young man who chose to pass along hope even when he couldn't feel it himself. The end comes not with violence or drama, but with simple exhaustion. Your damaged lungs finally surrender to the constant assault of stone dust. Your weakened body gives out after one tunnel collapse too many. You die quietly in the darkness, surrounded by fellow slaves who promise to remember your name and carry your story forward. But this isn't really the end, because stories like yours have no true endings. They echo through generations, whispered in the shadows where power doesn't want to look. They remind us that behind every great civilization's achievements lie countless unnamed victims. Suffering made those achievements possible. The classical world that we admire for its art, and philosophy and political innovations was built on a foundation of human misery, so vast and systematic that it defies comprehension. The same culture that gave us democracy and theater and rational thought also normalized the complete dehumanization of entire populations. These weren't contradictions, they were complementary aspects of the same system. And if we're honest, we have to acknowledge that similar systems exist today. They're hidden better, sanitized by layers of legal complexity and economic abstraction. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Powerful people still exploit the powerless. Societies still build their comfort on others' suffering. The vulnerable still disappear into systems designed to consume them while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone else. We live in a world where children are trafficked for exploitation while society debates philosophical questions about consent and agency, where pharmaceutical companies create addiction epidemics while funding research into the nature of mental health, where technology designed to connect and educate becomes a tool for predation and manipulation of the young and vulnerable. The same moral blindness that allowed Greek intellectuals to torture slaves while writing about virtue allows modern citizens to enjoy products made by child labor while advocating for human rights. The same compartmentalization that let respected philosophers rationalize cruelty lets contemporary leaders ignore systematic abuse while speaking eloquently about justice and progress. We tell ourselves that we've evolved beyond such barbarism, but evolution in human cruelty tends toward refinement rather than elimination. The systems become more complex, the justifications more sophisticated, the victims more distant from those who benefit from their suffering, but the essential transaction remains the same. Some people's pain converted into other people's pleasure or profit. The Greek symposiums, where where slaves were tortured for entertainment, have their modern equivalents in industries that sexualize children, in social media platforms that amplify self-harm among teenagers, in economic systems that treat human beings as disposable resources. The faces change, the technologies evolve, but the willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable for the convenience of the powerful remains constant. Perhaps the most disturbing similarity is how these modern systems hide behind the same kinds of intellectual sophistication that characterized ancient Greece. Complex legal frameworks obscure simple moral questions. Economic theories provide academic cover for exploitation. Technological innovation becomes an excuse for abandoning basic human decency. We create beautiful art while ignoring ugly truths. We write moving poetry while children disappear into systems of abuse. We develop brilliant technologies while algorithms designed to maximize engagement drive vulnerable young people toward destruction. We hold sophisticated philosophical discussions about ethics while the most basic ethical standards are violated daily in our names. The boy whose story we followed through these pages died, forgotten in a mountain mine. His name is lost, his suffering unrecorded in official histories, his voice silenced by those who found it inconvenient. But his experience echoes through time in the voices of everyone who has ever been treated as less than human for someone else's benefit. Tonight, somewhere in the world, another child is being sold to pay a family's debts. Another young person is being broken by systems designed to exploit their vulnerability. Another victim is discovering that the civilization they thought was built on noble principles actually rests on foundations of carefully hidden cruelty. Their stories are still being written. Their voices are still crying out for someone to listen, to bear witness, to remember their names, and honor their humanity. The question isn't whether such things happen, they do, constantly, everywhere, hidden in plain sight by our collective willingness to look away. The question is whether we'll continue the ancient tradition of moral blindness that allows us to enjoy the benefits of systematic cruelty while maintaining our sense of ethical superiority. Whether we'll keep telling ourselves comfortable lies about human progress while actual humans suffer in the shadows of our enlightenment, or whether we'll finally acknowledge that the price of our civilization has always been paid by those who had no choice in the transaction, that the boy in the mountain mine died for the same reason children die today, because societies have always found ways to rationalize the unthinkable when it serves their interests. The marble halls still echo with his cries. The beautiful mosaics still conceal the stains of innocent blood. And somewhere in our own gleaming cities, in our own sophisticated institutions, the same ancient horrors wear new faces and speak in contemporary languages while the essential evil remains unchanged. We are them, they are us. The only difference is time, and time has never been a barrier to human cruelty, only an excuse for forgetting it.